Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibuyers? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here on this Friday. We made it to the weekend. Hope you guys have something fun planned. Maybe you're just going to chill. I'm going to be working hard. I have one kid in St. Louis. I have one kid at the beach with the rest of my family and one at home in the bed, not feeling too hot. So I'm going to take some time. I've got things to send to listeners that I've promised. Check my inbox. Keep researching this case for sure. Still planning to get the Discord out at some point. Hopefully this week. I've been promising that for a while. I definitely now feel people's pain when I used to try to explain Lori Vallow to them in like 10 minutes. And their head would kind of spin because I underestimated how much research I would need to do to really get a good grip on this case. That's why you haven't had an episode out from me about this case for 2 days. Taking it slow, I want to make sure I can be as accurate as possible. We're going to go through the autopsy today. I'm not a medical examiner. I have researched some things to hopefully make it a little more layman for everybody to understand the horrific injuries that Ellen sustained. If I get something wrong, let me know. I need to correct something. I highly, highly recommend, if you hadn't, like I told you in the last episode on this case, go listen to Joseph Scott Morgan's episode on this. He was live at CrimeCon last year in Las Vegas when he did it. His opinion and his knowledge on what Ellen endured is something that helped me to better understand really how impossible it is. This was a suicide as ruled. Can't believe we're even still saying that 12 years later. It's insane. Music fact of the day, Guardians of the Galaxy. That soundtrack is amazing. It reached #1 on the US Billboard Top 200 charts, becoming the first album soundtrack in history consisting entirely of previously recorded songs to top the charts. Give it a listen if you haven't. It's full of good ones. All right, so we're going to go to January 27th. This is the day after Ellen was murdered. This is when the autopsy takes place. The medical examiner was Dr. Marlon Osborne. It seems like the only people that think this was a suicide are the powers that be that touched this case. Everybody else, obvious what happened here. How many wounds did she have? 8 stab wounds to the chest, 1 to the abdomen, 10 to the back of the neck, and 1 to the scalp. The chest wound where that knife was stuck in at the crime scene was still present at autopsy. There were no fractures of the facial bones and no petechia, which would indicate strangulation. On the next episode, we're going to get into other medical examiners who looked over crime scene photos, the medical examiner's report, and everything they could to give very different opinions. Let's see what Dr. Osborne found during his exam. I thought about doing just the major stab wounds and focusing on the traumatic ones that were life-threatening, but at the same time, it's important to go through each single stab wound because each one of those stab wounds caused Ellen pain. We're going to start with stab wound A of the chest. That was shallow. There was bleeding in the soft tissue, which means she was still alive when that injury happened. The pathway of that is front to back. Stab wound B of the chest. That was shallow. There was bleeding in the soft tissue. The pathway front to back. Stab wound C of the chest. That extended through the skin and the muscle of the right side of the chest and the right collarbone. There was bleeding in the soft tissue and the muscles on the right side of the chest and under the right collarbone. Pathway slightly right to left, front to back, and slightly upward. At what point does this knife start to slip in her hands? None of this makes sense, y'all. It's so infuriating to read these documents and see where we are today. Stab wound D of the chest. Shallow, with bleeding in the soft tissue of the chest, front to back. On this slide, and also slides that represent the serious stab wounds that were life-threatening, I put together some graphics to give a visual to those of you who are on YouTube watching this of how this went into her body and what it did to her. If you're on YouTube, please hit subscribe, hit the notification. You'll get alerts when I post a new episode about this case. Now, stab wound E of the chest, that was 4 inches deep. I have a ruler up on the screen showing just how deep that is. That went through the skin and muscle on the left side of the chest. That went through the left second intercostal space. That's the space between the ribs into the mediastinum. The mediastinum is the central compartment of the chest cavity. It's located between the two pleural sacs. Pleural sacs cushion the lungs. The left upper lung lobe had been incised. There was hemorrhage in the adjacent soft tissues and muscles on the left side of her chest. Also, the pericardial sac had been cut. This is a sac that your heart sits in, and her aorta had been nicked. As we know, the aorta is the artery that gives our whole body oxygenated blood. What happens when you nick your aorta? Symptoms of that include sudden, severe, sharp pain in your chest or upper back, also described as a tearing, stabbing, or ripping feeling. The heart, by the way, it's not pumping as it should. It's not able to squeeze and expand like it normally does. It's got fluid around it. You have this injury, and we don't know what order these stab wounds came in, but we have several injuries that would have immediately began to cause Ellen's symptoms. And to say that she still had the strength to inflict some of these more serious wounds that caused her death after any one of these big stab wounds, it's totally impossible. I've spoken to a couple of doctors over the last couple of days. They did not know anything about this case. I sent them the medical examiner report, and I had one doctor say, "This is the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life. Clearly a murder. No way she did this to herself," but here we are. 12 years later, still ruled a suicide. She had 20 ounces of blood in her left pleural cavity and 16.9 ounces of blood on the right pleural cavity. What does that cause? Well, it causes difficulty breathing because your chest cavity is filling up with blood. She had 4 ounces of liquid and clotted blood around her heart in that pericardial sac. The pathway of that was left to right, front to back, and slightly downward. Stab wound F of the chest, shallow bleeding in soft tissue, pathway front to back. Stab wound G, shallow with bleeding position front to back. Stab wound H of the chest that went through the skin and chest muscles through the right sixth intercostal space and almost an inch into her liver. Well, the liver, what is it? It's full of blood. You're going to bleed out. Our liver passes about 1 liter of blood every minute through it, maybe more. You think about the amount of blood loss that would happen very quickly after that liver has been incised. She had intra-abdominal blood, as would be expected. The pathway is slightly left to right and front to back. Stab wound I of the abdomen. That was about 2.3 inches through the skin and muscles of the abdominal wall. The way it was explained to me is, think of curtains. You hang curtains, the top is secure, but the bottom flows freely. Well, that's our intestines. They're attached to the mesentery, but they float down. Otherwise, they'd just fall into our pelvis. She had intramesenteric bleeding. She also had intra-abdominal blood. The pathway of that is slightly left to right, front to back. Incised wound J of the scalp to the right side of the midline of the scalp. So not directly in the center, just to the right. The wound was around 2.5 inches long. It extended through the skin and the scalp. Now, if you go to gavinfish.com, he has a more graphic photo so you can really see the gravity of how terrible this wound was. What I have on screen, I just try to keep it a little less graphic. It was a horrible looking wound, y'all. Just terrible what happened to this woman. Stab wound K of the neck. That was a shallow wound with bleeding in the soft tissue. The pathway of that slightly left to right, back to front. Stab wound L of the neck. There was a shallow wound with bleeding in the tissue. The pathway is slightly left to right, back to front. Stab wound M. That's a shallow wound with bleeding in the soft tissue. Pathway is back to front. Now I'm going to put a graphic on the screen here. Stab wound N as in Nancy of the neck. That was a deep one, 3.1 inches deep. It extends through the skin and muscles of the neck through the occipital triangle and into the ligamentum nuchae. That had a defect. What is the ligamentum nuchae? It stretches when we flex our neck. It also is what helps bring our neck back to an upright position. If she had a defect in that, would she be able to control her head coming up? Just another question of how she did all this to herself. The small vessel overlying the cerebellum were incised, which says to me with that scalp wound and then this neck, why are we not seeing more blood in this crime scene? I've seen one photo of where she was sitting, where she was found, And we heard there was a couple of little drops of blood spatter above her on the countertop. But with all these different wounds and especially hitting the liver and things like that, why is there not much blood? I don't think they even tested to see if there was any cleanup. Spray a little luminol, see if something's been swabbed around, but it wasn't done. There was a subarachnoid bleeding over the vermis. The pathway was left to right, back to front, and upwards. What are some symptoms of a hemorrhage on the right side of our head? Well, that would be a headache of abrupt onset, nausea and vomiting, inability to walk, much less stab yourself, dizziness, vertigo, loss or alteration of consciousness. We don't know what order these wounds came, the more serious ones especially, but you tell me if somebody's going to be able to keep stabbing themselves with these major wounds or even the pain from the shallow ones. Like Joseph Scott Morgan said, it's like death by 1,000 cuts, the old saying. Stab wound O of the neck, that was about an inch deep through skin and muscle. There was bleeding in the soft tissue, and the pathway is right to left, back to front. Stab wound P of the neck through the skin and muscles of the neck, that one was nearly an inch deep. There was bleeding in the soft tissue and muscles of the neck. Pathway is right to left, back to front. The other day, I cut myself on the thing that separates the aluminum foil. It has those teeth there that are very sharp. I just reached in and kind of grabbed it to reposition it in the drawer because it was hanging it up. And it cut me. And I'm going to tell you, it hurt for an hour solid. Think about how sensitive our chest is, especially in this upper chest. Think about our back and the upper back, our scalp. This woman was in immense pain the whole time. Stab wound Q of the neck, that was just under an inch deep. It went through the skin and the muscle. There was bleeding in the soft tissue and also in the muscle. The pathway is slightly left to right, back to front. Stab wound R of the neck, just under an inch deep and through the skin and muscles, bleeding in the soft tissue and the muscle. Pathway is slightly left to right, back to front. Stab wound S of the neck, that was close to an inch deep. It extended through the skin and the muscle. Pathway is slightly left to right, back to front. Stab wound T of the neck, one of the biggest stab wounds she had. It extended through the skin and muscles of the back between the second and the third vertebrae. That was laterally. It incised the dura covering the adjacent spinal cord. What's a dura? Think of it like a sleeve that protects our brain and our spinal cord as a covering over it. There was bleeding in the soft tissue and muscle of the left side of the back. Also, a defect in the dura and a focal epidural hemorrhage, which is a bleeding between the inside of the skull and the outer covering of the brain. That is a life-threatening condition. It usually requires immediate medical attention, or it can cause brain damage and or death. Now, with this wound, she also had bulging of the cervical cord. That's what he wrote in his report, below the dural defect. Now, of note, neuropathologist Dr. Lucy Roke, Rouke. If you've been with me a while, you know sometimes I butcher names and I apologize in advance. But Dr. Lucy examined the spinal cord and determined there is no defect of the spinal cord. The medical examiner said that this injury was evaluated grossly by neuropathology, and it was concluded the injury to the spinal cord would not have incapacitated Ellen, and she could have been able to continue stabbing herself. I call hogwash. Joseph Scott Morgan, the host of Body Bag, said on his episode about this case, it's almost an unimaginable feat for her to do this to herself. He also reminds us that the C1 to C3 vertebrae, that's home to our brainstem. That is essential for life. It controls all the things we don't think about controlling, like breathing, heartbeat, all the things that we need to be alive every second. He said, this is the area, if you want to kill somebody instantly, this would be where you go for. He also talks about the location of the stab wound and the fact she had other significant injuries which would have been causing her terrible pain. There also were multiple bruises in her upper and lower extremities in various stages of resolution. You do the math. DNA analysis showed the blood on the knife and clothing belonged only to Ellen. As far as I know, they did not even see if there were any fingerprints on this knife. Analysis of Ellen's laptop provided no additional information. Officially, the cause of death, multiple stab wounds. Manner, we know at first he had homicide, but quickly changed it to suicide. Why? Your guess is as good as mine, but you're probably right if you're thinking what I'm thinking. Aside from the pain from just all the stab wounds, no matter how shallow or deep, these major injuries that are all devastating, the liver has been cut, the aorta has been cut, a knife through the neck that touches the spinal cord. The lung has been nicked. She keeps stabbing herself with these fatal wounds with the strength and the flexibility needed to get behind her back, and we're still at suicide. Okay. Bruises. Let's talk about those. They were found on the right upper arm. The right forearm had 3 round bruises. The lower right abdomen, the right thigh has a vertical row of round bruises, and above the right knee. Dr. Osborne is no stranger to incomplete and sloppy autopsy reports. He was reprimanded in 2012 after taking an extended leave from June 28th, 2012 to August 27th of 2012. Let's go through the reprimand. It says Dr. Osborne and 2 other doctors discussed Dr. Osborne having all of his outstanding autopsy reports completed, whether the report was finalized or not, prior to this leave of absence. Dr. Osborne assured the other doctors that he would have his outstanding dictations finished prior to his absence. They removed him from autopsy rotation to give him enough time to get this finished. Dr. Osborne gave his word he would be caught up by the time his leave started. 17 cases were either incomplete with autopsy reports or inaccurate information. He didn't complete the reports and he did not inform his colleagues so they could make arrangements to have those cases completed. It says incomplete, inaccurate, and or unnecessarily delayed reports can have significant impacts on the families and agencies served by them. Not to mention legal proceedings where the autopsy a lot of times is the key piece of evidence or a big piece of evidence that shows murder. In an attempt to complete the pending and unsigned cases that were left after Dr. Osborne went on leave, they discovered further errors and discrepancies, some of which were very severe and could have great consequence for the families. There were 4 cases from 2012, 1 from March, 1 from April, and 2 from May, where the cause of death was put into the CME, but the reports were not finalized, signed, and turned over for review. As a result, these cases could not be completed and death certificates sent out, but they were delayed because you did not complete the case in its entirety. Trends observed during the review of Dr. Osborne cases. He did not routinely describe postmortem changes. Description of postmortem changes should be a routine component of all autopsy reports. That's very important because, like in Ellen's case, she has this trail of blood from her nose to her ear. But I don't see anything in the autopsy report about any of this. When completing the death certificate, Dr. Osborne did not routinely fill in the part where it asks if tobacco was a contributing factor to death. Lesions observed grossly, for which a microscopic section is taken for diagnosis, should be described in the report. They reference a case where a microscopic section was taken from a liver lesion, but not mentioned in the description of the liver. In the early part of 2012, they had a coaching session on his homicide cases with him. In one shooting case, he listed the clothing, but he didn't mention the presence of bullet holes or the presence or absence of soot or gunpowder. As a result, he had to review all of his gunshot wound homicides and clothing, assuming that the clothing was still available, to ensure proper documentation of the presence or absence of gunfire residue. So he had to go through all that and then add those findings to the report way after these autopsies had taken place. Additionally, in the coaching sessions, it was highlighted the importance of complete and proper documentation and the need to proofread his reports to be sure the documentation accurately reflects findings on the autopsy. The same case had errors in his description and interpretation of the gunshot wounds. They give the example of him failing to mention specific features of the gunshot entrance wounds. Even more severe and dangerous flaws in his work were seen in a case that was reviewed by looking at photographs and circumstances, clearly showing evidence of strangulation and the manner of death homicide. The autopsy photos clearly show a ligature mark around the neck and petechia of the eyes. His report read no petechia. The report describes the blunt hemorrhage in a muscle, but doesn't describe another hemorrhage in what appears to be the sternothyroid muscle that is visible in a photograph. The report describes a retroperitoneal hematoma and states there is no trauma to the left kidney. A photograph clearly shows what appears to be a renal laceration. Another poorly handled case was from April 25th of 2012. The autopsy photos show a large laceration and a subcapsular hematoma, which is fluid in the space around the kidneys. The rough notes made at the autopsy shows he observed a lesion and noted that, but the report describes a normal liver and makes no mention of the liver laceration. The report says, Dr. Osborne, these major discrepancies show an obvious lack of care for your work. Had the reports been reviewed or handled appropriately, you would have been able to formulate opinions as to the cause and manner of death much sooner. These long overdue cases show he is not reviewing his cases and doing appropriate follow-up and evaluations of the cases in a timely manner. One of the doctors said that in an overdue case, they had gotten telephone calls asking about the final cause and manner of death from family members. They don't need to deal with that on top of dealing with a death. Do your job and do it right. That's what's scary about this case in particular. Originally ruled it a homicide, I see nothing about potential strangulation, but another doctor who reviewed the photos and all the documentation begs to differ. We're going to get to that in the next episode. Now, while Dr. Osborne was on leave, another doctor unpended and amended 13 cases and signed an additional 27 cases for a total of 40 cases to finalize those while he's gone. Of the 40, only 3 didn't have toxicology results prior to his absence. So that's 37 cases he just didn't get to. It goes on to say Dr. Osborne must make significant improvements to the accuracy and timeliness of his autopsy preparation and turnaround time in all of his cases. Upon his return in April of 2012, there would have been random detailed scrutiny of his reports and close attention paid to his turnaround time. It says, we know you can do better, but failure to do so could result in further disciplinary action, including termination. In a memo, they highlight some of his cases that showed his sloppiness. So let's just look at a few examples of major mistakes or just not doing it. 2 cases that involved trauma to the body. A case involving a stab wound to the chest, not Ellen's case, just by the way. The end of the external examination contains the sentence, the body has no external evidence of recent significant traumatic injury. Considering the victim died of a stab wound to the chest, this sentence is inaccurate. Another case was a multiple gunshot wound death with the finding of penetrating gunshot wounds to the back. It is listed as penetrating gunshot to the torso. He also describes no injury to the scalp, lips, tongue, and back. However, there are injuries in each of those locations. The trauma to the torso documented a bullet perforating the heart. There's no documentation of a hemothorax and a volume as a result of that gunshot wound. He didn't document injuries to the face in another case where the autopsy photos clearly showed facial injuries. Another case of multiple gunshot wounds. There is no documentation of clothing or perforations to the clothing and no documentation to the presence or absence of gunshot residue. Also, the gunshot wound to the back was not documented if it was on the left or the right side. In another case of a stab wound to the chest, the case report says the chest wall has no injuries. The victim received a stab wound to the chest. So, what's interesting is this. We're going to get to this on the next episode. Dr. Osborne had to give a deposition about Ellen's case, in that he is on camera insisting he has never had a reprimand ever in his life. Lord have mercy, y'all. That's it for today. On the next episode, we're going to go through some other doctors' findings who have very different opinions of the ones Dr. Osborne gave, as well as go through some of his deposition about this case. And we're going to keep moving from there. I'm trying to keep it in a chronological order. That's kind of how I like to do things. So that's where we're headed next. Appreciate you guys. We will see you soon. Hope you have a good rest of your day.